Okay, we're going to get started this afternoon. Welcome everyone to this incredibly important conversation. My name is Setti Warren. I'm currently the executive director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard Kennedy School, formerly executive director of the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School. It's always great to be back and part of Shorenstein events. I want to, in a minute, just welcome our incredible panel this afternoon to offer some insight around how the media's coverage of the Chauvin trial and verdict has affected how we think, our public policy, our politics, and the rest. We know media is so instrumental in shaping public policy, and I'd like to get into a fruitful conversation around this. I'm looking forward to it. Before I introduce our fantastic panel, just a few housekeeping items. I'm going to get into a little bit of a discussion with our group and conversation. I'll ask them some questions. And then I'm going to allow for our participants in the audience to ask questions. You can, and I'd encourage you to do this, put your questions in the Q&A section as you're thinking of them as we're talking. We'll compile them, and then towards the end of our talk, our conversation, I'll make sure we pull from those questions. So I'd encourage you to use your Q&A function along the way if something comes to mind, you'd like a question answered. So with that, I want to introduce our panel, jump right into this. So great to see Jelani Cobb. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker, where he writes about race, politics, history, and culture. His most recent book, The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, he is recently released. He teaches at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and served as the spring 2018 Shorenstein Writer in Residence. Jelani, great to see you and welcome. Tara McKelvey currently serves as White House correspondent for BBC News and covered the Chauvin trial on the ground in Minneapolis. A former national security correspondent for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, Tara wrote about the relationship between media and U.S. covert operations as a fall 2012 Shorenstein Fellow. There seems to be a commonality here in regard to Shorenstein Fellows, which is good. Adam Serwer, it's great to see you. Adam is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers contemporary politics through a historic lens. A spring 2019 Shorenstein Fellow, Adam recently covered the Shorenstein trial from Minneapolis, and he has a book coming out next month called The Cruelty is the Point, the Past, Present, and Future of Trump's America. Welcome, the three of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to jump into this important conversation. I'm going to jump right in. Jelani, we'll start with you. Yeah, I've recently read some of your reflections on the verdict, and it made me wonder how you think the media coverage of George Floyd's death and the Chauvin trial has affected public opinion on policing and the Black community, as well as racism overall in the U.S.
That's a huge question. I think if I can take the most recent incident and then kind of work backward a little bit.
Yes.
I think that I spent about 2.5 weeks in Minnesota around the trial, a little bit after the trial. And one of the first things that you have to comment on about the coverage is that the coverage was severely hampered just because of the COVID protocols. And so, there were pool reports, people were basically doing like a platoon system, where two reporters would go into the courtroom, take notes. They'd alternate, one person in the morning, one person in the afternoon. They'd file pool reports, and everyone kind of reported out from the pool reports. So that gave a kind of homogeneity to what was being reported out. And then the other part of it is just, quite frankly, the court TV aspect of it. So a lot of us even for people who, while you weren't in the courtroom, there was a bank of TVs in one of the federal buildings. And so they were seeing what the public saw. And that meant that the real story was outside of the courthouse. And in that regard, there was a disjuncture. I mean, you would kind of expect this, but it was really particularly profound in this case, a disjunction between what the local news understood and the stories that were on the ground, and then the story that was being reported out. There was an implicit kind of understanding for national outlets that the Chauvin trial was the culmination of what had happened. That this would be, the ability to get a conviction here would really determine, whether justice was possible, or, whether there was going to be any closure for this horrible incident and so on. And that really was not the story in that community. They tended to look at it as one thing among many. The most vital concern that I saw there was the fight over George Floyd Square, which is still being waged. The community there that does not want, some people do not want that 4-block area to reopen to traffic, and some other people who do. And then concerns about the police, should the police be able to police there? Do they want an autonomous zone? And the future of what will happen, and the fight between the residents and the municipal powers. I thought that was really much more indicative of where things are, a year after George Floyd's death. And so there's that. I don't want to get into like all the other stuff, because that is, that's a lecture. You're going to go through the whole thing. But I will say one thing about George Floyd. The coverage of his gruesome, spectacularly gruesome death was directly associated with the volume of response that we saw with people in the street across the country, across the world, and the fact that they watched, it was a snuff video, they watched this man die. And that presented a paradox to me, though. Susan Sontag has written about this compellingly, that there is an inverse relationship to the proximity to someone and our willingness to show their death. We are, for all the kind of horrific events that we saw ISIS commit, some of which were against Americans, we did not show that. And for the famous incident where they show in Vietnam, the Vietnamese young man who's being killed, and you can see the bullet as it's exiting his head. But we did not see any of those images as they relate to Americans. And so the price of recognizing the loss of George Floyd's humanity was a process which tended to compound the inability to see George Floyd's humanity. And so it was a kind of square root effect in watching that. And I don't know what the alternative was. I don't know, if you don't show that image, that I don't know you necessarily create a better outcome, but it's certainly a paradox that we have to grapple with when these things come up again in the future, which unfortunately they most certainly will.
Jelani, thank you for that. And also your analysis of how this was covered, which results in probably how people think about it. And then also this video, this horrific video, which I think a lot of people are struggling with in regard to seeing or not seeing. And that's a nice segue, Tara, to you. I'm wondering, as you were on the ground there covering this trial, I'd love for you to give some reflections on what you learned hearing directly from people on the ground. And beyond that, are there some things that didn't get attention that, during the course of that trial that you think should have gotten attention? I'm struck by Jelani's point around the square that's still not unresolved. I don't know how much. There's been some coverage of that, but so I'd love to get your reflections on that.
Sure. I was there for the whole trial. I was there for weeks in Minneapolis, And the first day that I went to the building where the trial was held, the county government building, I remember I came, it was like kind of late morning. And when I got there, I saw this guy getting out of his car and he had this sniper rifle with him, this like shiny black gun. And he was dressed really nice, not in a uniform, just like sort of elegant street clothes. And then there was a couple other people around and somebody had left like their latte cup on the top of the car. So I was looking at the gun, kind of like fascinated and also like a little bit worried about this coffee cup falling off. And as I was like staring at this gun, this woman shouted out at me, "Stop looking at my husband, he's whatever." And I look over at her and then she says to me, "We're packing too." So she said that we're packing, so she's got guns on her and she's in a bulletproof vest. And I'm just like, this does not look like a good scene. And she said that they were afraid that the white supremacists were going to come. So they had taken weapons to the county government building. They had become vigilantes. So that one of the big stories that wasn't being told from the street was this conflict between the way people there felt like the police weren't taking care of them. And there's this conflict between the under-policing and the over-policing. You know, you have the police doing these horrific things to people during ordinary, traffic violations. And then you have these neighborhoods where there's no police at all, or hardly any. So when I was talking to this one guy right outside of the building, and he was like painting this mural, this like really beautiful image. And I asked him at one point, like, "What's this mural of it?" He's like, "Well, you know what it is. You know this image." And I was like, "I really don't. I could never figure out what the picture was." But I asked him what he wanted done in terms of reform. And he said, "There's not enough police here." So I think this understanding of the role that police play in these communities is distorted. If you look across the country and cities, the arrest rate for murders when they involve Black victims is really low. The Washington Post did a study that showed of 25,000 murders over the past 10 years, there were about 25,000 unsolved murder cases. 3/4 of them involved Black victims. So there needs to be some sort of balance between this, of course. And you saw that play itself out in Minneapolis. During the jury selection period, one of the people who was being considered for the jury said that in his neighborhood, police cars would drive through after there was a shooting in the neighborhood with the song "Another One Bites the Dust" playing on their radio. So you can't imagine, I mean, you would just hate those police officers. So that needs to be one of the questions that the media looks at, the under-policing and over-policing of communities, and also should be really one of the main things that gets resolved in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Tara. This is one of the things about ground up coverage, understanding rather than top down coverage, as I like to think about it, is revealing what's going on in the community, not just around that incident, but how the people in the community feel about the state and whether they're being protected and how that influences and whether they're getting the same opportunity to take care of themselves and feel safe or not. And so that's a great point. And those discussions are starting to happen. This a good segue into my question for Adam. We know there's been a lot of coverage, and Jelani pointed this out, of media coverage around George Floyd's murder and other police killings. And it's caused a number of people in the white community to be more conscious about it, but also, call for change. I was really struck, by your recent piece, "There Will Be More Derek Chauvins," Adam. And, as people are calling for answers to this, you write some things about the condition of policing. So I'd love for you to expand a little bit on that.
Well, I think the point that I was trying to make there, I think, is related to Tara's point, which is that, you have a system, and Chauvin himself is an example of this. You have a system where public servants are empowered by the state to use lethal force, but you don't have sufficient accountability for the use of that power. So what happens is people like Chauvin, who have long disciplinary records replete with excessive uses of force, never face any trouble. And because they never face any trouble, their colleagues are unwilling to call out officers who use excessive force because there's no point. All you're going to do is make your colleagues mad at you, and the guy who is using excessive force is actually probably not going to get punished. And that has a reverberation within the communities, that are dealing with high crime, which is that why would anybody talk to a police officer who can hurt you, get away with it, and no one's going to care. And I think there is, cell phones have opened up this world. I think, back in the 60s and during the civil rights movement, a lot of the images that moved white people related to the civil rights movement and convinced them that there was a crisis were images of police brutality. I mean, many of the iconic images of the civil rights movement are images of police brutality. And the cell phone has sort of created this window that did not previously exist into a world where police officers deal with Black Americans and Latino Americans in a way that is that white people don't often see. And that caused at least a temporary kind of awakening about the existence of these problems that, we did not have the same kind of ability to document them as they were happening that we did before. That said, I wrote this last year in the midst of the protests. These sort of awakenings tend to be temporary. We can look back and we look at American history, and there are these moments where white people become incensed at the lack of racial equality and its tension with the ideals that Americans think of themselves as upholding. But these awakenings tend to be temporary, and I think you could see in the sort of public opinion literature and in public surveys that already the sort of realization, the awakening that happened last year is already kind of subsiding, and people are changing their minds about this sort of stuff. I think the rise in violent crime has something to do with that. But as I said, those two, these things are related. The police, the police have sort of, the political entities that represent police officers have done a great job of saying, if you hold any police accountable, the crime rate's going to go up. But the truth is really the reverse. It's impossible for them to actually solve or deal with crime if the communities that are suffering from crime are terrified of the police and have reason to be. I think Chauvin is, for a lot of people, it's very easy to look at even the police unions initially, when that video came out, were sort of distancing themselves from him because, they want him to look like he's a bad apple and not part of a systemic problem. But the systemic problems still exist, which is why we're going to see more incidents like this. We've seen incidents before this one, and we're going to see more after it, because the underlying systemic problems, which I think, some of which can be solved on the federal level, but many of which are really local issues, have really not been resolved. And Chauvin is really just one example, one prominent example that captured, the attention of the nation, but one that, is indicative of a larger issue.
Adam, I really appreciate what you said.
Can I say something to Adam's point really quickly?
Please, yeah,
Just
please
a
jump
quick
in.
addition.
Yeah.
I think Adam's correct, and I think that when he said that a lot of these things are going to be addressed on a local issue, not federally, that runs us into another problem that makes it really intractable, which is the cultural part of this. One of the reasons that police have been able to operate with impunity is that, despite the saying that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, they do not indict police officers. And, this is partly about a widespread public deference to the authority of police. And when we don't look at African Americans, when we look at the kind of declining investment of trust that Americans have in American institutions, Congress, the presidency, the media, they don't trust any of us. They don't trust big business. They do, however, trust the military, they trust small business, and they trust police. And so getting past the legal hurdles are kind of clear, we've known that, but getting past the cultural and psychological hurdles is even thornier and more complicated. And you saw that really in the Chauvin trial, where the prosecutors time and time again had to try to paint Chauvin as the antithesis of the police department that he in fact represented for 19 years in good standing, was the senior officer. He was allowed to be in a supervisory capacity with those three other officers who were there when and participated in the actions that ultimately took George Floyd's life. And so they had to drill into the heads of the jury that convicting him didn't make them anti-cop. And that kind of coddling in the face of a just abject murder, the fact that you have to coddle in that way goes to just how deep the cultural part of this is.
John, thank you for that. Just as a follow-on for a minute, staying on that point, I guess my question to all of you, one, you mentioned something. Chauvin's been on that force for, what'd you say, a couple of decades?
19 years. Mm-hmm.
He's been doing things, right, for 19 years. He's getting attention because of this graphic, terrible murder. My question to all of you is, where is the reporting now? Obviously, the reporting was not revealing these types of behaviors, right? Where is it now? And how does it contribute to this cultural question and perception, Jelani, and that all of us are, and that Adam, you alluded to, and so did you, Tara, about how people think about the police, and then how people in the community think about the police, and different races think about police. How does reporting, where's reporting on this now, and what does it have? What do we need to think about in regard to reporting in the future?
I mean,
that's for all of you.
In all honesty, I think there's a lot of great reporting about the police. I mean, if you look at like the Baltimore Sun, they've done tremendous reporting on problems with their police force. There's a lot of, on a national level, there's a lot of great reporting in the New York Times. I mean, the Washington Post has won Pulitzers on its reporting from police. I mean, the cultural understandings that we're talking about are really deeply rooted, and they're related to larger issues of race and civil rights in this country. And those things have been intertwined for many, many years. And you add that to, I think most people don't come in contact with the police that often. Most police, go through their entire careers without drawing their weapons. And most of us, when we, to the extent that we think about the police at all, it's because we're watching, cop shows on TV. So there's a big, I think, cultural perception about the way policing works that sort of really prevents people from thinking of, thinking about how these systemic problems could exist, because they go against, their cultural understanding about how these things typically work. And as Jelani said, one tremendous example of that was in the trial when the prosecutors said, you can vote to convict Derek Chauvin without thinking of yourself as anti-police. You don't have to be one of these crazy anarchist radicals who wants to abolish the police to say that a guy who committed murder on camera should probably go to jail for it. So I think, there's not, and I think, there is also just a deep and old part of American culture that deals with violence and justice, and violence as a kind of justice, where people, I think there's sort of an American expectation that even if cops are technically breaking the law when they get rough with people, that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be tough guys, and they're supposed, they're out on the street and they're supposed to show these guys, who's the boss, and who, just really like enforce the law in that sort of bending the law type way. And that's just a very deeply ingrained part of American culture that predates television or radio or anything like that, but very much manifested in those things as soon as they were invented. You think about like Gunsmoke or Law and Order. So I think it's not, there's just a tremendous historical, cultural, pop cultural element to this that is not, it's not a switch you could turn on and off.
Setti, thanks for asking that question. And Jelani's point about the way people, and also Adam, the way you're describing the way people see police, it was interesting. They had a study that showed that, about a year ago, the trust that people had in the police was at about 53%, 52%, kind of relatively low, at least in terms of whether or not they believed that the police would respond in the same way towards whoever they were responding to, regardless of their background, race, or whatever. But now the survey from USA Today showed that now it's up to 69% trust the police. So at first I was like, well, how is that even possible? Like, after the reporting that I've done over, these past couple of months, focusing on the Chauvin trial, my views of the police have changed dramatically. But because of all the publicity about the police and the way you had the police chief testifying during the Chauvin trial and people coming forward and denouncing Chauvin, it made, I think, the public pay really close attention to police activities. And a lot of them came away saying, oh, okay, well, they're doing a decent job in trying to address these injustices. But of course, it's not happening. It's just in this one specific case and this one specific trial. But trying to explain to people and helping them understand what's going on with the police is really, really difficult. And it's a process that you're seeing unfold right now. One thing that you remember is, like, you remember how they would always, like, the news accounts would always be like, officer-related incident, officer-related shooting, or something like that. It's kind of this anodyne language that you think, like, oh, well, I'm sure that the officer was right. But you saw some real changes during the trial. With the Daunte Wright shooting, the headlines after that were officer mistakes taser for a handgun. And when you saw that, you're like, what? Like, what kind of idiot would do that? It was like Keystone Cops. So the press releases that the police were sending out, and also the messages that the police were sending out, were more accurate about that incident, and showed also a change in their efforts to, like, get information out to the public, and then the reporting to follow that, a more accurate description about these interactions and the shootings and what happened behind them.
I appreciate those thoughts. Just as a reminder, if folks want to ask a question, they should do that through the Q&A function. We're happy to entertain additional questions. I wanted to just follow on a little bit on a thread here about, Adam, how you had mentioned there's all this interest in what was going on in policing, injustices and things like that right after George Floyd's murder. And the public opinion just waned. I think some of you have answered a version of this question, but through how the prosecutors set up the case against Chauvin and the like. But I'm wondering why you all think there's just been this shift. And Adam, I know you said it's historic when things like this happen, but I really would love to hear your opinion on why the shift away from the concern about racial injustice and inequities and just disparate treatment.
Well, I think there's a couple of factors. One is obviously, there's a certain amount of press coverage about, the rise in the murder rate and tying that to, protests against the police, whether or not they're actually related in any way at all. Another is that Donald Trump is gone. Having Donald Trump in the White House saying racist things every week really sort of drilled into a lot of people's heads that, wow, white people who didn't necessarily think about race all the time, wow, this is genuinely a problem. And now, Donald Trump's gone. The vice president is a Black and South Asian woman. It's not that the actual problems are gone. It's just that one of the most public symbols of racial inequality, the person in charge of the country, is no longer, this buffoon who's saying things like, I don't want any immigrants from, quote, S-hole countries, things like that. But I also think, again, these are not things that millions of Americans go through their lives without having to deal with these kinds of problems. And so for them, when it's not in front of their face all the time, it's not something they think about, and it's not something that they think of as a serious problem. And so as a result, their feelings about whether or not it's an emergency or something that really needs to be dealt with are going to wane.
Thank you. Did Jelani or Tara want to weigh in on that one? Or
Yeah, I also think there's been a concerted effort to attack the credibility of the people who have been raising these issues. I mean, there's virtually a crusade against quote unquote wokeness, which, first off, we should press charges for the misapplication of what was once hip Black vernacular and has now been totally colonized and made lame. But this idea of people being kind of incompetent, irrational, nonsensical people who took one American studies class, idolized Fidel Castro and have been trying to destroy the country ever since. It's kind of a stereotype that they've presented for the people who have been making very substantive points about our criminal justice system. And so I think that satirical approach has had an effect. And at the same time, the very opposite is true. When I talked with Keith Ellison about how it is that he came to be in charge of this case, the Attorney General of Minnesota, and he took over the prosecution of Derek Chauvin, he said it was the people in the street. The people in the street, made this demand and said that they did not want the county attorney there to prosecute that case for reasons stemming from previous prosecutions that he'd handled. And the governor heard them and made a few calls, and that was how Keith Ellison wound up in that case. That is directly attributable. That is influencing policy, influencing the outcome of that trial, really, and making tangible benefits and tangible gains in terms of their objectives. So it's far from the kind of ridiculous caricature view that we've been presented with, but that caricature has been effective in some ways, and that's one of the dynamics that's changing the tenor of these conversations as well.
those are excellent points, and I loved your point, Jelani, in regard to Keith Ellison answering you. People in the streets are the folks that got me to take this case, because the other folks weren't going to be able to do it in a just way. I think that's a powerful counter to that narrative that's out there. Tara, did you want to comment at all?
Oh, I have lots to say, but I'd love to hear what the questions are from the participants.
Great. That's great. So just a few things. There's a question about where we are with qualified immunity, and generally if this is going to be changed or not, if not, why. And then there's another question in regard to historical connections and patterns of slave patrols, role of police forces and reinforcing power hierarchies as well. And one last one, I'll just do all three and then you can respond. Someone was responding to Adam's description of people who, most people that interact with police might be, this person says that might be true for most white people, but there are a lot of Black males that do have interaction with police regardless. And so the person's asking about the coverage around that issue, the disparity.
Yeah, just to be clear, that's the point I was making, is that we were discussing a plunge in public opinion about Black Lives Matter among white people. And the reason is that white people don't end up interacting with the police that much because white people and white neighborhoods are not as heavily policed.
Right.
But I mean, yeah, sorry, please continue. Oh, sorry. As far as qualified immunity, I mean, that's something, obviously the scope of qualified immunity has grown beyond, whatever it was originally meant to be. And that's part of the negotiations right now with Congress about the scope of qualified immunity in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I think that it's something that the police unions in particular, police advocacy organizations, they do not want quality immunity trimmed at all in any way, in any sense, because it is an incredibly broad protection for them. And it protects them from for civil liability for virtually anything. when you look at some of the individual instances of qualified immunity and what it has protected police from, that it's supposed to, like, the legal rationale is something like they should have reasonably known that this was a violation of someone's constitutional rights. You hear that and it doesn't sound crazy, but people have gotten away with crazy behavior under that aegis. So I think it's something that they really don't want to lose. And I think we don't know yet whether or not Congress is going to trim it at all.
Great. Did anyone want to briefly comment about the slave patrol history question?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated kind of question, because there's been a kind of talking point that the kind of slave patrols were the first police departments. That's not true. But people did deputize individuals, white individuals, to patrol and to prohibit the fleeing, the escape of people who were enslaved. And that way they were serving a kind of patrol function that antedates the actual creation of police departments, which is mostly a 19th century function as well in cities. And when you see the police departments coming about, one of the major things that you see them involved in is strike breaking. That's as much a motivation for people to create a police department as anything else in cities. And then even kind of detectives and crime solving and all that other stuff that doesn't get around to the 20th century. So we have a kind of tiered development. So I think the best way of saying that, and forgive me if I'm parsing language here, is that slave patrols served a policing function. But to say that they were the first police gets you into like a different kind of assertion that I don't think necessarily bears out. One last thing that I'll say about this too, in this conversation, we really have to have a conversation about guns, because one of the things that when you talk with people who don't have the kind of experiences that we've been talking about in this conversation, when you talk with people who live in suburbs and you talk with people who are white, who are middle class or not necessarily middle class, it is the fear of crime and the fear of harm that also catalyzes this sensibility about police and policing. And that fear is largely driven by the fact that we are a country, it was partly driven by racism, but it's also driven by the fact that we're a country that is awash in firearms. People are just kind of running around with guns everywhere. And, and the police have a mentality that that corresponds to that. And so I think that part of the conversation we're going to have is that if we want to change the function of policing in the society, we're also going to have to change our relationship to weaponry and the kind of jeopardy that, loose firearms all over the place, that anybody who can walk into a store and walk out with a 9mm or an AR-15 is going to be an obstacle to changing what policing is in this country.
Thank you for bringing up the gun question, Jelani, as well. I just want to fit a question in here from our audience. The question is, the video of George Floyd's murder, what do panelists think about the importance of public witnessing versus the almost pornographic replaying of the video over and over again through the news, media, and or online? So I'll flip that to the panel.
Just, briefly about the video itself, like it was so hard to watch it. There's no question. It's just wrenching. But the fact that it exists is so important. After George Floyd died, he was murdered, the police put out a statement that said, "Man dies after medical incident during police interaction." It's almost like an Onion headline. So you see, if it hadn't been someone, if there had been no one there with their camera, nobody would have known what had happened. So there's no question that it was just hugely important, and it's going to continue to be important. And the video was the center of the trial and the center of people's awareness at this point.
I think this is just one of those questions that doesn't have like a great answer, except to the extent that media organizations really can make decisions about how they curate this kind of information, which is that they can obtain it, they can describe it, and they can ask. I mean, like you can ask, readers. You don't have, like, instead of say having an autoplay video or something like that, you can ask readers you can warn readers that it's about to be described, and you can also say, here's the video if you want to see it, but not necessarily autoplay it and blare the images, everywhere, everywhere anybody might see it. I think it's a question, to a certain extent, it's a question of media responsibility. Obviously, it's not a new problem. We've encountered issues like this before. There was a whole conversation about it a decade ago with, these emerging videos from ISIS and stuff like that, how to respectfully deal with videos that show a person being murdered. And I think, it's just a question of media responsibility. The question, as far as, do we need these videos? Do they need to exist? And I think the answer is obviously yes, because they are, incontrovertible documentation of, incidents of crimes that are committed under the color of law. And without them, the police can more easily manipulate public opinion or dishonestly represent what happened, as Tara just mentioned. In particular, in this case, the description that was offered by the police simply did not match the events that we ultimately saw occur.
Yeah, I think we encountered this when I was working on a frontline documentary about policing in Newark, and we were debating what to do with it. And the solution that I proposed was that we show Derek Chauvin's face, or that we show his torso, but the look on his face conveyed enough menace that I don't think that we had to show George Floyd's body, or that we have a completely black screen and you hear the audio of what's happening, but we don't show the images. And we wound up doing the former. We showed a cropped image of Derek Chauvin. And I also think that there's a sense for media organizations where they may sunset videos, where they're going to show this once and only once, or they will show it over the first 48 hours of the incident, and then they're not going to show it after that. I think that there is a real element of trauma that people experience in seeing it. And finally, to Adam's point about evidence, I think the curious biography of lynching photography, I think, points to this. We see the postcards now, the kind of horrific actions that people took in the South, and the mass lynchings and the just grotesqueries that are captured on postcards that people proudly sent to one another. And because of the changing attitudes and the changing sensibilities, people don't want to think that this country was capable of this, that white people gleefully indulged in barbecuing human beings for recreation. And only because people sent these images as a display of their pride are we now able to make the moral condemnation that should be associated with it, that they've had an ironic kind of boomerang effect. But I think that we should still, even with that in mind, we should still be very guarded in how we disclose these images.
Thank you for that. I have another question. In your reporting, actually, let me ask this question. I'm going to read the question. The death of Daunte Wright reminded me of the shooting of Oscar Grant in 2009. There was horrible video coverage back then, and the crime became very visible to the public. I was wondering why nothing seems to have changed. So it's along the lines, it's a similar question. Has society changed? Why did it take until George Floyd for something to happen? So it's a combination of some of the things we've talked about. I don't know who wants to take that.
So unfortunately, I have to run. I have a flight that I have to catch.
Yes.
I'm really interested in this conversation, and it's certainly not a reflection of my interest in participating, but I have to get to the airport. So I just want to say thank you all, and and also join the point in saying that Adam's book is coming out. The Cruelty is the Point is really excellent, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it if you're interested in these issues
Thank you.
as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you for your brilliant input. Appreciate you.
Mhm.
So I don't know if the question that I just asked from the audience, whether either one of you wants to take it. I think we've covered some of this question, but either way.
I think one way to look at the video of George Floyd is that it's an accumulation. We have been looking at these videos for many years now, and this one was so particularly egregious, but it was also not the first time. It came after not just a long series of these videos, but it also followed the killing of Breonna Taylor by the police, executing a no-knock warrant, and also followed the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, whose killing was captured on video by two men who, were not police officers, but who were not prosecuted because the local prosecutor decided that they were acting in self-defense, even though that's absolutely not what the video shows. They literally chased the man down. So I think it was partially that it was an accumulation of videos. It was partially that this was the third such killing in a very short period of time. And I think also people, the pandemic played a role in that people were at home, and there were so many people who were sort of online because of the pandemic, that it just created a kind of, it was all the catalyst for a kind of explosion around this issue. But I don't think it was just, there wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just the one video.
And also, and Setti, you talked before, and also Jelani, about Derek Chauvin's face. It's very hard to know exactly why something changes the culture, but there was something about Derek Chauvin in that video that was so arresting, that was different from anything people had seen before. When I was in Minneapolis, I interviewed somebody who had actually been Derek Chauvin's boss at one point, and back when he was in the military, when Chauvin was in the military, and this guy said that he saw the video on TV, and then he realized it was Chauvin because he could tell by the way Derek Chauvin walked, his gait, and he said that. And then the guy was interviewing, he said, and Derek, his eyes. So I just kept thinking about his eyes in that video, and asked a lot of people in Minneapolis about it. You just couldn't get that image out of your own mind from seeing it. And I think that played a big role in why things changed and why people were so focused on that video.
No, those are excellent points, Adam and Tara. I did have a question. There's some stories recently about how there's some humanization that was attempted to be, injected into the trial, the humanization of George Floyd and his life. And then this past week, the media has really been promoting this picture of George Floyd's daughter walking into the West Wing with the white Marine holding the door. I'm just wondering about how this fits into this discussion, right? In regard to, in your opinions, how people think about these issues that are going to continue. They're not done because the verdict occurred, and they're not done because Chauvin's going to get punished. I'm wondering the juxtaposition of what we've been talking about over the last 30 minutes and these images we're seeing. Is there meaning to it? What's your reaction, please?
I'd love to hear what you guys thought about that image. It went viral. It was such a powerful picture of George Floyd's daughter. She's about 7 years old, walking in, and you have the Marine guard guarding over her, standing over her, right? I think it seemed very protective, this guard. And certainly that's not the kind of image that you would have seen during the Trump White House. So there's a really important difference, but it's just not clear whether that's, is that a good image that somebody needs to be protected in this way? If you take that image as a larger metaphor for the country, there were all kinds of messages that image sent that maybe are not so helpful for for the protest movement or for the reforms in police. It's kind of paternalistic tone to the picture. But I'm curious about what you guys thought about the image and what other people thought.
I think people like a happy ending. And so, and they want to believe that they can trust the state. They want to believe that they can trust the government. And so I think for a lot of people, seeing the Marine holding the door for George Floyd's daughter was a kind of way of saying that the state is working to redeem this injustice. And so that's a happy ending, but it's not really a happy ending. That's, in a level of emotional closure that people are projecting on the image. It's not something that the image actually symbolizes. The story's not over. The problems aren't over. They're still with us. They haven't really been resolved. And as a result of that, there's going to be more George Floyds and more Derek Chauvins. And I think the response to that image was really about a sort of emotional desire for closure to this story that made people feel good, because the truth is that there's not a whole lot to feel good about, just, either from, the conviction or from, the actions that the government has taken in the wake of George Floyd's death, which have not, there hasn't been much change on the federal level. We'll see what happens with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but that is not a particularly aggressive piece of legislation either. So yeah, I think it reflects more of a sort of, liberal sensibility towards wanting a happy ending than anything that actually really was happening in that picture.
That's an excellent summary, and Tara, asking those questions are important. I guess one last question, because we've got to wrap up. We're getting close to the hour. As we end, I'd really love to hear both of your reflections on two questions. One is, as we move forward, what's the future look like in regard to this question? I think, Adam, you started to answer some of that through your answers, but what does this look like? And second, what are the main challenges that need to be addressed to begin to fix the problem? You mentioned they're cultural, you mentioned there's structural, policing questions and issues. I'm just wondering, just very brief reflections from the two of you on that before we wrap up.
Just briefly, the legislation, Adam, that you were talking about, this policing bill, it's flawed is one way to describe it. But there's certain aspects of it that people are really behind. This idea of body cameras, like 80% across the country, people think body cameras are a good idea for police to have. So even though a lot of conservatives have issues with this movement, there's really uniform support for more accountability for the police officers. So there's some reasons to be hopeful about what will happen down the road in terms of what police do and what people know and how much about their actions and what the media will be reporting in the future.
I think you're going to see a lot of essentially pitched battles in local jurisdictions between police reform advocates and organizations like police unions, and their allies. Whether it's local district attorney races, whether it's referendums on collective bargaining, you're just going to see a lot of these fights on the local level between police reform advocates and police union representatives and their allies. And I think, some of those are going to play out one way or the other, in some place like Philadelphia, for example, where Larry Krasner was just reelected, you saw the reformers win. And here in San Antonio, they did a referendum on collective bargaining that the police unions narrowly won. There's just going to be, there's so many police departments and jurisdictions across the country, and there's so many different activist groups who are working for change, that I think you're just going to see a lot of these, just dozens and dozens of fights on the local level, and some are going to go one way and others are going to go to the other.
Well, Tara, Adam, thank you so much for this incredibly insightful conversation. I really appreciate your thinking and your work. It's so important right now. We're so pleased to have you join us this afternoon. This was really important. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you for joining our discussion this afternoon. Take care.